If you've been listening to the Business of Biotech podcast for a while now, you'll recall that Erin Harris has joined me to co-host a few episodes. Erin's my friend, colleague, and chief editor over at cellandgene.com, and she just recently launched a podcast of her own. It's aptly named Cell and Gene, the podcast. And if you're working in the cell and gene space, you should give it a listen. It's a collection of interviews with the industry and academic leaders moving the space forward. And you can find it at cellandgene.com or anywhere you listen to podcasts. Cell and Gene, the podcast. Check it out. Welcome back to the Business of Biotech. I'm Matt Pillar, and I'm once again joined by everybody's favorite biotech finance guy, special advisor, Allan Shaw. And you know, Allan, I got to thinking yesterday, I get quite a bit of fan mail on your behalf. I get quite a bit of, positive feedback on the episodes we record. And I know people, it's obvious people like to hear what you have to say. But I don't know if I've ever properly sung your accolades as I usually do with my guests, give a little bit of biographical history. And if I have, it occurred to me that if I have done that, it was probably like 60 episodes ago. So just real quick, for anyone curious as to why you've endeared yourself to this show, I'm going to bear with me for a minute while I toss up a few biographical highlights for our listeners. Is that okay with you? I'm gonna
that's fine. I'll try not to blush.
I'll sing your praises. So for those of you following along at home, wondering, where Allan gets all of his wisdom from, Allan is a 4-time public company CFO, 5 now. He's signaling me 5. Yes, Portage is your 5th engagement. Okay.
Absolutely.
Yep. So 5-time public company CFO to companies including Syndax Pharmaceuticals and Serono, now Portage. He was managing director and life science practice leader for Alvarez and Marsal's healthcare industry group. He's served on, he'll correct me if I get this one wrong, 5 public boards.
That's correct.
Okay. Yep. Chairing 2 audit committees and 2 compensation committees along the way. He's currently special advisor to a portfolio of biotech companies. Some I'm sure he'd be willing to mention, and others are clandestine skunkworks operations. He's put a lot of notches in his biopharma business belt over the past 20 odd years of biotech corporate governance and financial management, including oversight of more than $4 billion, which is probably dated information, $4 billion in public and private financings, including several IPOs and numerous business development transactions. Now, Allan and I were discussing the fact that, he's rooted in finance, but he's far more. He's a Renaissance man as it relates to biotech. But his background is built on this foundation of accounting. Allan started his career many, many moons ago, sliding beads on an abacus at Deloitte and Touche, which those listeners of a certain age will recognize Deloitte and Touche as being one of the big 6, and now I think maybe big 4. I'm not sure what number we're at. Global.
Yeah, one time high 5, but now it's big 4.
Big 4, yeah. Professional services and accounting firms. So for anyone wondering, that's how Allan has honed this sharp wit and gained the perspectives that keep me coming back for more of him on this show.
Thanks, Matt. Really appreciate it.
You bet. It occurred to me, I think we probably on episode 1, I might have kind of framed up who you were, and a lot of folks know, but for those who don't, that's where it comes from. So on today's episode, Allan and I we're gonna dig into the state of clinical trials from the business perspective, and based on some of what I've read, some of Allan's writings on the topic and conversation with him, I'd sum by saying it ain't necessarily good. So I want to start out by quoting you, Allan, from a column you wrote for Life Science Leader. I don't know. I think it was like maybe mid 2019, let's say shortly before the pandemic began. In this column, which touched on a lot of points, clinical trials being a central theme, you said, the greatest factor impeding the creation of innovative drugs for common diseases is the enormous cost and risk of clinical trials that constitute the largest single component of the R&D budget. In fact, phase 3 trials are by far the biggest expense and the biggest risk of new drug development, typically incurring 90% or more of that drug's development costs. So I want to start right there. It's a strong statement, and I'd like you to unpack for us why the status quo is not sustainable.
Yeah, a lot of it is, like night follows day. Going back to my formative years, I used to sit down when I was an auditor, and I used to ask my team, why did the auditor cross the road? And the answer was, they look at me, and the answer simply put was because they did it last year. And that's how we've been doing things. But with that said, the current system is a roadblock, as you pointed out. Simply put, clinical development process is antiquated and is an impediment ironically, to optimal patient outcomes. Everyone believes, and rightfully so, in the sacrosanct, the gold standard of traditional randomized controlled trials to generate evidence regarding the benefits and safety of drugs. However, it's slow, it's inefficient, and it's limited in terms of the questions they answer. To kind of put it into brass tack terms, it's the way we go approach clinical trials, particularly for the big diseases, is akin to trying to buy a suit off the rack. Yeah. One size does not fit all. And I think that there's enough science around to let us know that one size doesn't fit all. We used to think breast cancer was breast cancer until we got smart about it and realized, there's an infinite number and kinds of breast cancer, and that's not limited to that particular pathology. So, the science has moved well ahead of the traditional processes. And I think it's certainly time to rethink how we do that and stop crossing the road, because we always have. And I think there's lessons to be learned looking elsewhere in the industry in terms of where you can learn from in terms of what's working and what's not working. Clearly, this isn't working. And it's not necessarily just my particular view. A former FDA Deputy Commissioner of Medical Affairs noted that the way we use highly empirical statistical methods that really predominates is generally inflexible and really restricts innovation for overly large trials. And when you're thinking about trying to come up with a design that's general, right? There's no general person out there. Everyone's different. As we said, it's not a homogeneous. When you break it down to real life, doctors don't treat populations; they treat individuals, and it's typically very expensive to undertake these studies. And bottom line, you go back to my accounting. At the end of the day, everything's about following the money. You can really learn a lot by where the money goes. And when you look at these studies now, the biggest studies, but the risk benefit doesn't work. When you look at more precision medicine and more subtype in patients, those studies have a much higher probability of success. And when you're looking at general productivity in the industry, those things, I think, correlate to it. Yet when you mandate these big studies for big populations like that, it's really going back to the future.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So, and you've referenced, I've seen you reference or heard you reference the orphan drug approach. I think you're alluding to that a little bit, at least as something that's closer to an appropriate model for clinical trials. And I've spent time talking with, young, innovative biopharma leaders who are taking that approach as they design trials. So let's hear a little bit more of that case. And I'd like to hit on a few different points, starting with trial design. What does that look like, that's different from the status quo that's costing so much money and time and inefficiency right now?
I think some of the trial design speaks back to what we're talking about, the large general studies. And, I think with biomarkers now and other methodologies of being able to identify subtypes where you're going to improve the probability of success, it allows you to kind of focus at that point in terms of patient selection, enriching your studies to be able to improve that. And those are a lot of the characteristics associated with why orphan drugs have been very successful at the end of the day, because it's a very subset group of people, usually suffering from a distinctive mutation or absence of a protein of some kind, or something is just not working. And so you can really, your patients are screened for you at the end of the day. So you've already enriching your studies. And because of that, rather than having to run, 20,000 person studies for cardiovascular diseases, you can literally, in certain cases, get a drug approved with 50 patients. And you can often bypass that very costly phase 3. Once you demonstrate safety and proof of concept, you're really off to the races. And the FDA has made a lot of concessions in that respect. And it all comes back to capital efficiency, because, they made those concessions, and you see where the money's going right now. It's going into oncology, and it's going into orphan diseases just by the sheer magnitude of dominance and the number of drugs that are being developed, the number of drugs that are coming to market and approved. Yeah. And I think adaptive clinical, adaptive trial designs allow you to be able to make changes on the fly. You can actually learn from what you've been doing. And if something's clearly not working, you can modify it. It's all part of the recipe that you prepare up front. But I think that is definitely where I think things are going. And it makes a lot of sense for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah. Obviously, wherever there's change, oftentimes, right, there's challenge as well. So the change that you're referencing, I have a follow-up question on like biomarkers and highly, specified trials. That creates a bit of a challenge right up front in terms of selecting the right patients. Obviously, the desired outcome is theoretically going to be better. But how big a challenge is it? Or would it be for biopharmas who are kind of used to, like, let's take oncological indications, for instance, who are used to going out there and like you said, at one point we thought there was breast cancer, and now we know that there are multiple forms of breast cancer. So for a biopharma to go out there and identify patients and do patient recruitment on a broader scale to make the shift to, biomarkers and highly specific populations of patients, how big a challenge is that from a business and financial perspective?
It really requires you to have your house in order and your ducks in a row. You really have to understand your compound at the end of the day. What are the properties? What are the mechanisms of action? Where's the right point of disease intervention to be able to understand that information? So it really, I think, puts more emphasis on having robust preclinical data in order to understand the PK, PD data dynamics, because that's really important in terms of determining the right dose. So, and that also correlates to understanding, because if you know the mechanism, then you know what you're looking for in terms of biomarkers.
You mentioned that plays right into the adaptive trial design. You mentioned, having the ability to pivot in a trial when you identify a population that benefits most from the drug. That also would create, and I would assume, maybe to the more skeptical or cynical among the folks following the space, a communication challenge, right? Like if you're so two challenges come to mind from the outset, and I'll pose them both to you and ask you to reflect. The first challenge being, okay, to your point, why did the auditor cross the road? Because that's what he did last year. There's a challenge in accepting or rolling up your sleeves and designing an adaptive trial, building flexibility. So what sort of needs to be overcome within the organization to embrace that rather than fear it? And then two, on the backside of that, when you do pivot during a trial, what goes into effectively communicating that pivot to stakeholders so that the pivot isn't seen by, as I said, those cynical among the followers as a juke or right? Like you're zigging when everyone anticipated you would zag. So maybe spin, if you will.
When you think about the industrial jeopardies, that about 90% of what we work on isn't going to work.
Yeah.
The zigging is part of the business, right? I think when you were talking with Ian Walters recently, I think his big point was 80. You got to know what to do when 80% of the time it doesn't work, right? You can pick the targets 20%, get 20%. I guess restating it, I don't want to misstate him,
but no, that was about right.
But he basically said that, in terms of drug development, in terms of the effort, 20% is picking the right assets and 80% is figuring out what to do when it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. So, you need to know how to build adaptability into it. So, you can almost say like Post-its, where have they been before we had Post-its? It seems too obvious and too logical that we should build flexibility into our studies. It kind of embraces a lot of different concepts that are drawing a lot of steam right now. You're looking at adaptive studies, you're looking at real world studies, and when you're looking at adaptive, and precision science, and it's really, you have the ability to kind of house all of that under one roof. Because you take in real world evidence as you're dealing with it, you're adapting as it occurs, and you're also drilling down to patient subtype populations such as precision medicine in order to kind of enrich and improve your probability of success. And there's even other things that are coming out now that are further moving that way. Decentralized studies where you're leveraging technologies and wearables and monitors. So there's a lot of different ways to engage patients, to ensure compliance. Compliance, bottom line, it's all about compliance. That's the greatest headwind you have in terms of generating positive, successful patient outcomes.
The Business of Biotech is brought to you in partnership with Cytiva. Together, we're committed to helping the leaders of new and emerging biopharma companies navigate the financial, organizational, human resources, and regulatory waters you'll encounter on your way from discovery to the clinic and beyond. Check out a host of useful resources for biotech leaders at Cytiva's Emerging Biotech Accelerator at cytivalifesciences.com/emerging biotech. That's CYTIVA lifesciences.com/emerging biotech. And I want to get into that too. I want to ask you some questions around the FDA, which you referenced earlier, and just what sort of mountains need to be moved there. But before I do, another kind of simplistic question from a business perspective that I'd like your thoughts on. Adaptive trials, right? Like, let's say perhaps you begin your trials with an ocean of potential, and as you pivot, as you adapt, as you become more precise in the identification of patients who are receptive to a treatment, that ocean gets smaller. Again, very basic principle, very naive on my part to ask the question, but as your market gets smaller, your business opportunity, perhaps corollarily, gets smaller as well. How do you justify that?
The industry is an interesting industry, right? I don't think there's another industry that can actually sell products without a warranty or a guarantee. If you bought a car and it didn't work, would you get your money back?
Right.
It's so, I think the industry is going to become more and more accountable. I think there's going to be more and more risk sharing in terms of how and measuring payment and services on outcomes. So, this is ultimately, I think, a convergence of where things need to go. And I also think that people might also be willing to pay more if it's going to work. Mm-hmm. You might ask how much more. Its prices are already ridiculous, as from a lot of people's perspectives. For good reasons. I don't want to infer anything other than that. But with that said, if you look at the orphan drug model, if you're they charge prices for small populations. You can charge $250,000, $500,000, and there's certainly situations that have gone higher than that. And these are blockbuster products, so you can still make money, and it still works because you're delivering something that works for patients, and you're getting the right returns or appropriate returns for the risk reward, given
Yep.
the industrial jeopardies. And a lot of times when you're ultimately, it's not necessarily just the cost of the drug you're developing, it's also all the costs of all the drugs that aren't working that you're looking to, it's a
Sure.
business at the end of the day that needs to be recovered. So I think a smaller market really speaks to, there's pricing flexibility in terms of that, and you have less headwinds in terms of reimbursement. If things work, that's a good outcome for everybody.
Yep. Okay. All right. So yeah, the FDA, shifting back to that, you referenced it earlier, quoting a former FDA commissioner, acknowledging that things need to change. Yet at the same time, I mean, it's almost, when I think about it, again, maybe overly simplistic, but is it a chicken and egg scenario? Who drives the change, the industry or the agency? And if the agency is driving the change or involved in the change, what needs to change at the agency to lay a new clinical path forward?
I can go in a lot of directions with that.
Well, feel free, take them all.
In fairness to the FDA, they are working on it now. They've been really embracing adaptive studies. They're doing a lot. I Spy and a number of others. I think the FDA is right now a little bit of an abyss right now because there's no permanent leader there, and that's a political situation that's probably better served for another day. But in terms of the short answer to your question, it's going to require the collaboration of regulators, payers, and industry actors to get that to happen. And it's happening slowly. But from my perspective, the easiest way to make things work, and I would call it laissez-faire, but to me, you can learn from past examples. And that's why I've often called out the Orphan Drug Act and what's gone on with orphan drugs is an illustrative example of how you can make something out of nothing. Before the Orphan Drug Act, there were, the number of orphan drugs that were under development, it was spotted. It was, no one cared about orphan drugs, and, our hearts went out to the patients associated with that, but not a lot was being done to help them. As an advent to that, it really stimulated, I think it did more than they ever intended to do. I see multiple drugs now being approved for orphan indications, and I'm wondering how can it be an orphan drug if you got all these drugs for them? But at the end of the day, and you see it also in terms of oncology, where there's a huge unmet medical need. Again, it comes down to the risk-benefit ratio, and when you're dealing with morbidity and fatalities associated with cancer, it's a lower bar to demonstrate success. And in the past, we demonstrated success by improving patients' lives by days, weeks, months. It was relatively marginal. Now we got some programs out there that are having profound impact on some of the patient populations. Still a lot more to go there, but you're seeing the flow of capital in terms of the number of drugs that are being approved, the number of drugs that are being developed. And really, it's to the detriment of a lot of the common indications. Certainly, they're not getting, when you're thinking about the number of patients and the comorbidities people have, there's not enough being done on that front. And personally, I think a lot of it has to do with capital allocation. It's just not, there's no cost benefit. If some of the things that in my mind that the FDA can do to make this more capital efficient and create more favorable risk-adjusted returns would be, first of all, reducing the cost to develop these drugs. And the way we're going about them right now is a huge, huge, huge hindrance. It certainly keeps, you think about where all the innovation's coming from. It's coming from biotech, and big pharma's buying that innovation, and that becomes their products at the end of the day. And because of the dynamics we've just mentioned, nobody's really touching that in biotech, and no one really wants to be, and everyone's going to scorn them, because why are you going after a mass market type of indication for such a small company? So it is a chicken or the egg a little bit in that regard, and because innovation's coming from outside big pharma's walls, they're less likely to do this in-house too, and bet the ranch on these big costs. So I think that's really important. That really comes down to the trial designs and patient selection and enrichment, and really knowing your drug before you go into the clinic. Everyone's in such a rush. A lot of times they skip a lot of this, the work that they probably should be doing to have better knowledge of their compounds in the first place. I think there's economic incentives, tax credits, grants, waiving fees to provide incentive for certain programs. You saw them, the FDA tried to do something like that with antibiotics a few years ago. In that spirit, obviously they need to do a little bit more. That is not enough been done there. And I think that's a part of the commercial dynamic. And that can be, we'll save that for another day. You can provide better, faster priority reviews, maybe even provide vouchers. Those priority review vouchers have been for very niche areas. But, that's created an incentive for people, and actually a cottage industry in terms of trading some of those things for some of the companies. The FDA has demonstrated the ability to have administrative flexibility with orphan drugs in order to adjust endpoints and being flexible on how to do it. Post-market approvals ties back into real world data. There's a lot of different ways you can go about shrinking the time from in the development period and trying to get things out to patients. Because right now, the loser are patients at the end of the day. And the money's going to go where it's the easiest and the lowest path of resistance. It is a business at the end of the day, so you need those incentives. You can consider like orphan drugs; they get additional market exclusivity. Maybe we consider that. And all these things translate into higher probabilities for approval. And it also, going back to your question about the small market, not only can you charge higher prices, but it's also very much more commercially efficient. You don't have to build out huge sales teams, so, it's going to be a little harder when you apply that to common chronic diseases, because the population is so big. But I also think through digitization, a lot of the detailing and the way we used to promote drugs has gone the way of the dinosaur. And there's definitely opportunities to do that stuff much more cost effectively. And there's a big industry in digital marketing and patient engagement. So there's a lot of different ways that I think you can harness into that to create the paradigm that's needed to kind of bring this into the 21st century.
Yeah. So a lot of the things that you referenced, you referenced approaches or strategies that can be taken here and now, but it occurs to me as you're talking through them that and correct me if I'm wrong here, that it's incumbent on the biopharma, the sponsor, innovator, leaders within the biopharma organization to go out and attempt to leverage those opportunities, right? Like it's not like you're going to go, let's call the FDA and see what avenue or avenues we can take to design a flexible clinical trial, expedite some of our approvals. It's incumbent on the biopharma to sort of do that research, develop a strategy, and then engage with what they want, right? Ask for what they want as opposed to ask for what's available.
Yeah, I think it's beholden to them. You're absolutely right. To define what they're looking to do. I think it's a good idea, certainly, to run it past the FDA, make sure everybody's on the same page, to confirm or get their input. But by all means, it's the companies drive the bus, right? The FDA isn't a consultant. They're a regulator. But they can be used helpfully, and I think people could probably reach out to them more than they usually do. I mean, to try to get that type of input, and I think it's capital efficient. I think all stakeholders win by it. So I think companies that do take a more enlightened approach to clinical design will ultimately demonstrated with higher levels of success.
Yep. So you alluded, in the time we have left here, I want to talk about what forces of change are in play now. You alluded to some strategies you can take with the FDA programs and opportunities that are available. But what are you seeing out there in terms of, like I said, I've talked with some biopharma leaders who are absolutely pursuing the biomarker approach, the precision medicine approach to their clinical trial design. What are you seeing out there in terms of, what forces of change are kind of driving the initiative at present?
I think it is about improving overall productivity and yielding better probabilities of success. And I think, proper planning does prevent piss poor performance, no matter what industry you see it in. But, I think AI is something to be reckoned with. I think we're very much in the first inning there. And, you're seeing it in different areas. Whether it's, I know with one of the companies I'm involved with, we have a couple of collaborations there in terms of identifying new assets. BioXcel Therapeutics is a very interesting company. They're using AI and they're having a lot of success there in terms of their ability to come up with transformative medicines in both neurology as well as IO. Through their algorithms and their learning machines. On other levels, you can also use it, I think, in terms of, correlating PK, PD data to compound elements, figuring out dosing and, again, improving probability. If you ever look at a Meyer-Kaplan curve, a lot of times, you're looking for separation between the groups. And sometimes you don't see initial separation. It takes a little bit of time. And that really speaks to the fact that you're not picking the right patients at the end of the day. So, I think it can really help with the patient selection side as well as the dosing side. So there's little elements, whether you're looking at drug targeting, dosing, but I think it really does will improve the probability of success. And like I said, BioXcel, certainly I haven't expected what has come out of there. So that's been a real pleasant surprise. I would also go on to say that, decentralized studies, I touched on it a little bit earlier, but I think, if you don't have, and I think that's probably been accelerated through this environment of COVID, because people really don't want to go into hospitals, right? Well, if you're going into participating in a study, why would you want to take additional risks? Mm-hmm. So, and nothing good comes out of a hospital. So, I try to stay away from those whenever I can. So, I think being able to go to decentralized studies and leveraging technology is a new paradigm. You can basically accelerate data oversight. It enables mid-course correction, which is really important. You can really see things as it's happening. Yeah. The old-fashioned way, you take it once every 2 weeks. Whenever you took data, now you're constantly monitoring things. So it really also enables more real-life settings as well. And as I touched on earlier, it facilitates patient participation. You're taking away people's excuses. It helps with the accrual rates because, again, why not? And then I think lastly, patient compliance. And that's really one of the most underspoken, I think, elements out there in terms of, successful outcomes.
Sure. Yeah. Quick question on the technology side. You mentioned AI, and I agree. I mean, there's all sorts of power untold there. But I'm curious what's the agency's appetite for AI, or is the AI activity that you see taking place strategically taking place prior to agency engagement and just helping develop smarter decisions for, the data that will eventually be presented to the agency?
It's an interesting question. And contemporaneously, I'd say it's much more the later, mm-hmm. because, it's really how you make the sausage. There's a lot of elements up front in terms of doing things in order to put your package together. And I think it saves you time. It's going to save you costs if you can get the things in compressed time development timelines. I see, in my crystal ball, and it may be even more advanced. Maybe I just don't get around it as much as I used to. But I would envision that it could be helpful down the road in terms of coming up with surrogate endpoints or secondary endpoints in terms of, data trends that you see over time with populations, natural history, and other things like that. So you can kind of come up with other metrics to demonstrate success. I know that when we're looking at some of the safety data on one of our companies, if you see elevation of certain elements, that's positive. So, if you can leverage that type of technology later on, I see potential. And I think that's going to require a leap of faith of the FDA. And I'm not quite sure where the appetite on that is. Right. But I think over time, if you can use that to accelerate the hypothesis, then prove that out subsequently, that in itself would be a major step forward.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, we're short on time, Allan. I've got to jump into a staff meeting on this channel. We're likely to be joined by a number of my editorial staff here any moment. So I appreciate it. That was a super insightful conversation, folks. Allan Shaw is leading the clinical trial revolution in biopharma. If you have questions on how to go about it, get in touch with Allan. But thank you, my friend. Always a good conversation.
Absolutely. Matt's in my is co-pilot on that revolution, so feel free to harass him as well.
All right. Yeah, we'll catch up with you next time on another exciting topic. But in the meantime, that's Allan Shaw. I'm Matt Pidler, and this is the Business of Biotech. We're sponsored by Bioprocess Online in partnership. We are produced by Bioprocess Online in partnership with Cytiva, a life sciences company that's as dedicated to the support of new and emerging biotechs as we are. You can learn more about Cytiva at cytivalifesciences.com/emerging biotech. And I'd also like to encourage you to visit bioprocessonline.com to subscribe to my newsletter. And if you like what you heard here, subscribe to this pod. Give us 5 stars and tune in next week. Till then, thanks for listening.